of course, feminist scholars have been working on critiques of theory for the longest time. Chela Sandoval, differential consciousness, Audre Lorde, Trinh Ha, people who are working in auto theory right now, Laurent Fournier. They're constantly looking at a different way of envisioning theory, so much so that you're not thinking about theory and thinking about other vocabularies for what theory could be, right? I will, I'll open up the space now because I don't want to ramble.
Cholin, do you want to pick up from Devika? I think, Devika, you highlighted two really great points. One is the notion of theory as erasure, and sort of the other being this differentiation between theory and method that works within colonial logics, right? And how that is replicated in the global South.
I actually, no. Go ahead, sorry.
I'm happy to listen further.
No, please. I just, after you're done, I'll quote something that I just was rereading, and from Linda Tihuai Smith, so.
Great.
All right. No, I really enjoyed what you had to say, Devika. And I think this idea of theory as erasure is an important idea. And I think we should connect that idea to the idea from Pythagoras. As we know, the word theory as we currently use it, perhaps first used by Pythagoras. Pythagoras, when he was speaking about the theorizer as a person who comes into the world to act as a spectator, a viewer of great things that whose greatness speaks of perhaps an idea of a godly being who's a creator of this greatness. Through these great things, these wonderful works of art, these wonderful performances, we're able to see something of this theos, this God, in a sense. We're able to connect to the creator, as it were. I think what's interesting is the way in which theory has become something which is greatly associated, as you say, with the West, with Westerners. And what we see, as is commonly understood, is a process in terms of which what happens is theory is created in the West and is applied by the rest. Theory is developed by the West, and we generate the materials for that theory to be proved, proven, supported, demonstrated in various ways. And in this whole process, as Mbembe wonderfully says, we have this terrible thing that happens, right? That all this research that we do, for example, about Africa, only really works to tell us what Africans are not, or if you'd like to put it in a different way, only really works to say that we are the other of the West. In other words, to get back to you, Devika, theory only really seems to work. The research we generate on the basis of this theory only seems to work to generate certain erasures. The word that I historically have preferred is the word denial. It seems to generate the possibility for these denials of who and what we are, what we represent, in particular, this who, right? What we are suggests is something perhaps that there's a possibility that we can find this through our theory, in the ways in which we are animalized, othered, made into things of various sorts to be observed in various sorts. Again, that link to theory as a way of viewing, a way of seeing, a way of gazing, right? And I think we need to recapture, reclaim this theory, take it away from its association with this Westernness, this whiteness, and begin to rewrite it. I'm working at the moment on a bunch of things, again, remembering Paulo Freire on the occasion, this year, the centenary of Paulo Freire's birth. And in that context, remembering again this idea that we read and write the world, we theorize the world, reconnecting the link between theory and practice, going back with Paulo Freire to the existential theorists, recognizing that what is at stake is a person who chooses, a person who has limitations, who has possibilities, a person who has freedoms that need to be understood in a wide variety of ways within a world that is highly constraining, and where a lot of those constraints are cultural, are imposed through these logics of whiteness, westernness, and so these erasures that you spoke of. So I think theory is something that we need to reclaim, in short.
How beautiful and powerful, Cholin, the idea of needing to reclaim theory. And what you said about what is at stake is the person. I think that gets to the crux of it and connects so well with what Devika was saying. Eddah, do you want to pick up from there?
Yes, and thank you all for having me. And I want to carry on with what Devika and Chasi have already set into context, and how I respond to the whiteness that we see in the South. And in particular, I just want to pick African experiences because that's what I'm really familiar with. I was happy to hear Devika say the role that feminist theorists have played in getting us to find something new. And in my thoughts, I'm thinking about, I am inspired by Audre Lorde declaration that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And just thinking about that, and as an African scholar, I'm just thinking, wow, this is it. What does Audre Lorde, what does the house, the tools symbolize? What does the master's house symbolize for us in Africa? Yes, and the global South in general, these unjust conditions, what Westernization, enlightenment has done and created these conditions in the South that get us to suffer every day. And because they are ordered in ways that we cannot escape their impacts. And so how within that framework, how do I, as an African, what theorization, how am I conceptualizing how we move forward, how we might move forward? Then I think of physical tools. You know, when you think about the master's house, any tool, there are tools there which can bring down any house. But what if we do not have access to those physical tools? What do? Then we have to look for conceptual tools, which are those that allow us to create this consciousness that allows us to pick up the arms and move forward. The necessity to develop this consciousness to act and bring about genuine change. How we think about the need to change our conditions is what is going to determine how we want our scholarship to do, how we are going to resist the damage that Western theory has done to us. Think about this. Communication education in Africa. how that theory itself, what it has done to the continent, how syllabuses from United States were implanted in all journalism schools in Africa and continue to use the same curriculum. And look at the effects of it. The use of radio, the radio continues to be, for example, I'll give the intention of journalism, education, and theory was to do what? Create outlets for government propaganda. And that continues up to today. Think of the use of radio in post-genocide Rwanda and in Kenya in 2007. It is all because of this theory that was implanted in our schools, in our institutions of higher education, that this is what you've got to do, remain the propaganda tool, outlet for governments. Think about what has come to be called the brown envelope journalism, where journalism serves the interests of the elites. And when we think of all this, you know, I am thinking of the impact, the ideas that my colleagues earlier on talked about, and I now provided the damage that all this theorizing and the actual practice, you know, all the interpretation of these theories has done to Africa. And it's my hope that we can embrace. Cholin said, you know, there are things we need to reclaim. And I am advocating, for example, we've got one of the things we need to reclaim is Afri ethics, you know, Francis Kasoma's ideas, you know, which were just pushed aside because they didn't matter. And look at Swaziland today. Swaziland still continues, its media there continues to play to the tune of the king and many other places. And the way out, if we could have sustainable use of media and communication resources for ourselves and our people, that will be good. And it will mean we are the ones that have to theorize how we want this media resources and communication resources to look like, and not necessarily fall back to what they brought to us. Thank you.
Wow, you know, it's just beautiful how the three of you connect together. So, you know, we go from erasure to looking at the need to reclaim, to Eddah, you talking about accounting for the damages that are created by theory, right? That this theorizing actually has had effect, the real effect on our communities in terms of damaging our community. So I also like from that conversation, your idea of tools and thinking through what kinds of tools then can we use to take down the master's house. How can we think of these tools as conceptual tools, and then connected with Colin's idea of how do we think of those tools as ways of reclaiming and reconnecting and building sustainable ways of thinking about media and resources. Your example of propaganda was a great example, you know. So I want to build on that to move on to the second prompt, and it really relates to, you know, the way you wrapped up, Eddah, which is what are the ways in which whiteness co-opts and colonizes the global South, destroying the environment and creating new spaces of profiteering. So perhaps, Colin, if you want to get us started.
No, thanks. Yes, thanks so much. I think that this is, of course, deeply connected with the very first prompt that we've been working with, right? We did not speak much about the word extraction, which is in that first prompt that you raised. And I think it's key to this question that you are speaking to now. I think we must recognize the ways in which an exploitativeness is at the root of the logics that we've been speaking about, these logics of erasure in some sense, these logics of denial, as I prefer to call them. Also associated with all of these, increasingly I'm really attracted to Lewis Gordon's concept of white license, this idea that when we speak about whiteness, we're also speaking about an idea, an identity, a set of practices that are licensed in a very particular way that has got very important consequences for the ways in which the world is organized. If you would like, you can think of James Bond, who many of us have grown up watching, as Lewis Gordon points out, with the license to kill, right? As opposed to simply having a privilege to kill, with a license to kill, with the license to exploit, with a license to practice misanthropy. In his earlier work, Lewis Gordon speaks about racism as really grounded in a particular type of misanthropy, a particular type of hatred, if you would like, for what it is to be human. Here we've got to really go back perhaps to the everyday and remember, for example, from where I sit in South Africa, where we had apartheid. Apartheid as a form of colonialism. Apartheid, which was declared a crime against humanity. Colonialism, which we need to declare a crime against humanity. Because all of these practices, which of course are foundational to whiteness as we currently know it. The history of whiteness is really the history of slavery, the history of colonialism, the history of apartheid. It's the history of misanthropy, the hatred of humanity in itself. And our attempts to, and so this hatred, what it's doing is it is feeding on. It is extracting its power, its vitality from humanity itself. It involves a fundamental attack on humanity. It is parasitic upon humanity in itself. And it therefore is able to pretend to be a form of life, of human life, when it in fact is a form of dehumanization, right? It pretends to be the heights of what it is to be human, when in fact it is quite the obvious, right? Or it is quite something else. It is something that does not exist in reality. So you go back to Fanon, who speaks about this idea that, of course, we have to talk about the white and the black and so on. But these things don't really exist, do they? Right? And yes, to be black is to perhaps want to be white, but to be white, what is that, right? That is not anything. It is a kind of dehumanized identity, but a dehumanized identity that gets its power, gets its authority, gets its consequentialness from the ways, from that sort of extractive logic that it applies. And that extractive logic, Mbembe in his latest book, tracks that down to capitalism in various ways, and a number of other scholars have done the same, right? I'm not so confident that we should only use the word capitalism to describe the extractive logic. I think we should do more work there. It is not clear to me, for example, that apartheid as it was practiced in South Africa really represented capitalism as such. I think that for the white population in South Africa, it represented a kind of socialism for the elite, right? So I think we need perhaps new words, new descriptions that are capable of explaining the broader logic more fully. A colleague of mine, Nyasha Mboti, is therefore, for example, developing this idea of apartheid studies. He argues, how come we don't have apartheid studies? We have Holocaust studies, we have post-colonial studies, apartheid studies, we don't have that. And he suggests that perhaps by engaging with this thing, we'll be able to understand these extractive logics more generally, not only in a place such as South Africa, but more generally. Thank you so much.
Cholin, as you are talking, I was thinking of the numerous evidence of extraction, the extractions that happen every day on the continent, as facilitated by the master's tools that the West, that global North has put in place, whether it is the World Bank, IMF, other international organizations that continue to make us dependent on the North, or even support of autocratic governments in global South, such as Mobutu Sese Seko's DRC, so that blood diamonds wars can happen. And that is where those extractions. So it is just a connection, whether it's, all these ideas that they bring, democracy, kill Patrice Lumumba, we put our guy there. That is the democracy that we want. And then we can extract all the minerals from DRC, and all the women, everybody there is safe. But the women that are being raped every day by the rebels. So that it is just, you are right to say that all this, capitalism doesn't just benefit everyone. It's benefiting the owners of the mines, and the women in the Congo are victims. Another way, another example to support this extraction is to see how, the fight to preserve the environment in Africa, the work of Wangari Maathai and the Green Belt movement, how it showed the link, the critical link between development, peace, human rights, women's rights, and everything. And if we could develop models and ways of thinking that could bring together all these ideals that we desire for our communities, as Wangari Maathai did, then there is some hope for us that we can be able to utilize what we have. Everybody knows how to plant a tree. Planting trees, as Wangari told the women, is the way you plant potatoes, is the way you plant beans. Let's save the environment. Her work is really groundbreaking in giving us ideas about how to do one thing to take care of so many things. And what is that one thing? Taking care of the environment. And another example that I have, which is a reflection of governments in action, is the dark side of chocolate farming in Ivory Coast. Look at the multinationals, the tools that are being used to extract wealth and to leave many farmers, companies as Cargill, Nestle, Hershey's, Mars, all of them, all they're extracting things from Ivory Coast and leaving the ordinary people poor. And guess what? They are bedfellows with the government and with the global north. Last but not least, on this is, I talked about the blood diamond wars in Angola and DRC. And even the biggest damage when the North colonizes, co-opts, and colonizes the global South. Think about the Rwanda genocide. How Rwandans, the Hutu governments, collaborated with France and other European nations and the inaction of the world to get to what Mahmoud Ahmadan captures in his book titled When Victims Became Killers. The victims, Rwandans themselves, they became killers. Why? It's because of how all this co-option to whiteness and colonialism happens. Yes, we think broadly, we look at very specific case studies and spend time to ask ourselves, what went wrong? And then what can we do? What can our people do? I'm done. Am I frozen?
No. Just awesome. Devika, did you want to pick up from there?
So I'm gonna, I don't know how much I'll add to what's been said, but so since I'm going to just repeat the question just for myself. How does whiteness co-opt and colonize the global South, destroying the environment and creating new spaces for profiteering? And I know I don't want to keep talking about what I'm working on, but I will, because I have been struck by a word that Linda Tuhiwai-Smith uses, and I just actually placed it in my paper yesterday in her book, Decolonizing Methodologies. She uses the word disorder, right? And I think that the use of, and I'm going to quote her, and she's relying on Fanon, and she's relying on Fanon and Ashish Nandi when she uses the word, picks on the word disorder, and I quote, "Imperialism and colonialism brought complete disorder to colonized populations, their languages, their social relations, their own ways of thinking, feeling, and interacting with the world. It was a method of systematic fragmentation, which can be seen in the disciplinary carve-up of the indigenous world, right? Bones and mummies and skulls to the museum, artwork to private collectors, languages to linguistics, customs to anthropologists, beliefs and behaviors to psychologists." So I think, and you know, I mean, there's the old saying, right, that that whiteness or the colonizer or the Westerner brought, or at least in the way that we think about late European colonization, you know, followed the logic of divide and rule. But I like this notion of, I prefer the notion that Linda Tuhiwai-Smith is using of disorder, because it really shows us how populations were segmented by colonizers, and in the way that extraction could occur really systematically. And I've been thinking about this in the context of COVID, in the way that extraction is occurring. And I'm from India, and as we know, and I guess we have a few other guests from India on the call right now. So I mean, think about the vaccine, right? I mean, just the very fact that we are stuck in this conversation where India exported more vaccines to the rest of the world and has only vaccinated 3% of its own population. I mean, talk about extractive logics, right? Talk about the way that we as Indians, and I can't speak for any, I'm only speaking for myself as an Indian, but to think that I mean, that is an inherently internally colonizing process, to think that you are not good enough to be saved and that you will save the rest of the world with the vaccine that you've sent out instead of saving your own population. I mean, that is the psychic wound of colonization. I mean, that is the kind of psychological damage that it does, that a government will think that exporting medicines to save the white world is more important than saving our own people, and that people are still voting for that government that is functioning on that logic, right? So for me, that, I mean, I have to think about it in the way that this is happening right now. And of course, the West, and or whatever you want to call the neoliberal West, the capitalist West. I mean, and who's not a capitalist, right? We can't just blame the capitalists. The capitalists are everywhere, also in the global South, extracting from themselves. So the point I'm trying to make is that I think disorder for me has, at least it's been on my mind, because the West functions on and is able to extract because of this disorder, right, that it has left behind, right? And I think that's, for me, I've been thinking a lot about that as I re-looked at your question, and also in the way that I've been thinking about it. And I really want to say, I had not looked at Linda Tuhiwai's book for 5 or 6 years, but because I was working on a project, I went back to it, and I have been stuck on this notion of causing disorder, and causing disorder in order to systematize a population, and the kind of psychological wounds that leaves, so that a population is intent on dissecting itself, is intent on I mean, it just gets it gets addicted to this kind of disorder, and then replicates it, right? And the disorder is based on an extractive model, which then the global South also takes in, right, as its own logic.
Wow, there's just so much powerful stuff in this thread of the conversation. So, Cholin, you talked about the idea of white license, and really for us to think through what underlies that white license, right? And connecting that to this fundamental sense of, misanthropy, the history of dehumanization that connects to whiteness. You also prompted us to think about the extractive logics in beyond sense, capitalism, and more. And you gave the example of apartheid studies as one way of looking at the ways in which these extractive logics have played out. Eddah, you talked about the complicity of the South with the North, and I think that's really powerful. And in the examples you gave, you delineate the ways in which authoritarian, autocratic governments in the global South have been complicit with the extractive logics of whiteness. And whiteness has propped up and celebrated those extractive logics. And then, Devika, thank you for connecting us back to Aotearoa and to the work of Linda Tuhiwai-Smith, particularly with the concept of disorder and the way in which whiteness has seeded disorder, but also you point to the seduction of disorder, where the South replicates the disorder in order to actually participate in it, right? So, we are at an amazing point of the conversation, and I want to now sort of move to this question of resistance and transformation, and what are the transformative possibilities. So the third prompt I had shared with you was, how do struggles in the global South offer methodological registers for dismantling whiteness and empire? So perhaps we begin with you, Eddah.
Oh, okay. So here again, I was thinking about very specific cases where Africa has experienced, and in particular, in this case, East Africa, some kind of resistance that comes from a combination of several factors, whether it is the culture-centered approaches, spirituality, organizing, and everything else that has been used to bring communities together, and also the experience of difficulties, the conditions that have been created. In this case, I focus my response on peace building, because I see particularly grassroots peace building initiatives in East Africa as really a form of strong resistance. And why is this the case? It is because, according to a leading scholar in peace studies, who argues that for a long time, the Western peace paradigm sees peace building as about transforming war-shattered polities into functioning liberal democracies, where the liberal democratic framework is seen not only as the gold standard of good governance, but also as the most secure foundation for sustainable peace. That is what the dominant paradigm proposes. But local communities come in and realize that no, this framework, this framework that is connected to liberal democracies, liberal economies, is not for us. What is for us? It is the struggle that it is the results that emerge from the pain of their suffering. I have done work in post-genocide Rwanda and in Rift Valley of Kenya, where there are very, very often ethnic clashes. And what I learned from both contexts is that communities have realized that the solutions to peace have to come from where the violence itself takes place. And they told me in East Africa, in Kenya, they told me Nairobi is not going to solve our problems, even though they created this situation for us. We suffer every day, and it's from this place of pain that we are going to find resolutions. Rwandan women told me the same thing. It is their ongoing trauma. It's their terrible experiences of genocide that become the source of strength. And for me, I have found these few pockets of women as really the source of knowledge about what peace building is about. I am not so interested in going to spend time in Addis, the headquarters of African Union, but I would rather be in the communities with these women who are suffering every day, and forgiveness being used as a method for survival. You are raped, you are deliberately infected with HIV, and those women look right in my face and say, we have forgiven, because that is the way to rebuild our communities. The model generally in Kenya, this idea has a Kiswahili word, amani mashinani, and it's a Swahili word that many communities are beginning to connect with. Earlier on, I think one of us talked, either Devika or Cholin talked about changing the language. And what these women have done is to create their own language for peace, not the one that the UN and the peacekeepers are giving them. They've created this, even in Rwanda, they have their vernacular words that are describing their work. And for me, that is very impressive. I find it really deep, and it's where we should spend more time learning and developing this language and bringing it to scholarship and made known to the rest of the world, and sharing these experiences, South-South solidarities. We don't have to share stuff with the North. We don't have to. I would like to know what women in India are doing so that I can share it with women in Kenya. Women in India would love to know how Rwandan women really manage to deal with rape when it became a weapon of genocide. So facilitating the South-South solidarity networks, and this is one of the reasons I find this workshop really useful. Mohan, thank you so much for bringing us together, because this is an opportunity for us to network as scholars and those of us who are still doing work in the South, and connect and learn from one another and really build those tools that have to bring down the house. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eddah, for sharing these powerful stories on the context of peace building. It's so powerful. And what, that I will take away that one sentence, you're saying that if you want to learn about peace building, you're not going to go to Addis to learn about it, but be in the community and learn from the women who draw upon their strengths to create a different language, a different register. And that becomes the way for South-South learning. That is just so transformative, Eddah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Do we want to go to you, Devika?
Sure. I had a few examples of what I think are, some movements in the global South, and specifically in India, that I think have been very publicized and are really critical for us to watch, right? And so, for instance, the Dalit resistance movement, that is an anti-caste movement, that is linked with, for instance, the farmers' protests, that is linked, for instance, with the women's movement, rural, urban. For me, the issue of indigenous, the issue of movements in the global South is the way that they often get perceived by activists in the West or by organizations in the West, is that they are looked upon as different movements. And I think that the struggle is to see that all of these movements are intersecting movements, and they're not outside of, so women's movement in India, of course, it's very diverse and it's vast, and there's a rural, urban, caste, class, migration divide, right? As you're looking at, I mean, even if you want to call it feminism, because I'm also sometimes wary of using the word feminism and instead prefer to often use women's movements, because feminism as we know it in the wave model comes to us as a US national discourse, right? It's even transnational feminism, for instance, has been co-opted as a US movement that really looks at feminism as a linear model that progressed from first from the first wave to the second wave to what is now intersectionality and transnational feminism, but it's still from the standpoint of US national discourse, right? There is so when Eddah talks about this South-South coalition, I think that's really critical. But I think what's really critical is for coalition building within countries in the global South to occur as intersecting movement, to look at social movements as intersecting and as deeply connected to each other, because from the standpoint of the West, it's really it's simpler and easier to look at, oh, you know, the women in India, and we need to do something about the women in India, or about the women in Afghanistan, because it's another way of segmenting. It's another way of dissecting and separating these movements from each other. And so I think for me, the notion of coalitional politics is not really whether the West is getting behind these, but are these movements actually intersecting with each other and are thinking of themselves as coalitions, right? And so then are therefore viewed as coalitions by the West, which is more invested in and is more comfortable if they're separate movements, right? Because then they don't have to worry about how their, you know, the money that they're sending for something might actually be affecting the women in these different ways. And, you know, they don't have to think about the complexities of aid, right? And I'm not saying that the West needs to be the audience, but the West, but one of the ways to think about movements is to really think about all of them as intersectional, and not in the sense that of intersectional feminism in the way that it comes to us as transnational feminism in the United States, but as social movements as intersectional movements. And I think that's really, really critical. It's really, and I use a book in my class. It's called Transnational Feminism in the United States. And really, it's not a celebration of transnational feminism in the United States. It's Leila Fernandez's work. And she really critiques, in fact, the transnational feminist movement in the United States as an inherently colonial social movement, right? And that it follows this national US state model. And then and that then gets replicated in different parts of the world as, you know, this sort of this very collective feminist movement, which is still really a very Western movement, right? So that's sort of what I have to say at this point. But I think for me, what's really important in resistant movements is coalitional politics, and that the more segmented they seem, the easier it becomes for the global North to pay little attention to some over others.
So Devika, my takeaway are two words, really intersectional, thinking about intersectional in a decolonial, anti-colonial way, right? And also to think about coalition and coalition building and finding connections really that sort of challenges the segmentation. Great, thank you. Shall we move on to you, Cholin?
Thank you so much, Mohan. Such a challenging question. I'll try to get back to the question in itself. How do struggles in the global South offer methodological registers for dismantling whiteness and empire? I mean, for me, the word struggle is important. What struggles are we talking about? Whose struggles? And I think we've been given some keys to understanding this from our colleagues in this discussion. Devika has talked about this idea of disorder, drawing on Linda Tilwali Smith. And this idea of disorder as something that happens through this attack on culture, this epistemicide that is associated with the West. This decapitation of peoples of the South that Ngugi wa Thiong'o speaks about. that happens at the moment of colonization, so that we are kind of disconnected from our ways of thinking, from our processes of thinking. And in a sense, we walk around as zombies, zombified beings, in a range of ways that need to be truly understood. In a sense, what I'm pointing to is that this disorder that you spoke of, Devika, I think is a disorder that is the source of struggle. That is the source at once of the ways in which we kill each other and we kill ourselves, right? The ways in which we work against ourselves, in the ways in which we become dysfunctional, disorganized. Now, here we need to go back to another route, I think. I find the work of Michael Tomasello really interesting. Michael Tomasello, who does work on an evolutionary theory that is, he asks the question, why communication? Why do humans communicate the way that we communicate? What makes us unique? He proposes that what makes us unique is that we are uniquely altruistic. We're uniquely giving, sharing, informing when compared with other animals. And this altruism becomes the fount of our competitiveness, our abilities to build cultures that are cooperative in uniquely productive ways. But of course, and if that is what is unique about human beings in relation to other animals, this altruism that enables cooperation. It is very powerful, Devika, when you say what colonialism does is it seeds disorder. It seeds the inability to cooperate. And I think therein you find the issues, Eddah, that you're speaking of to do with wars that are endless, wars that are unproductive, wars that are counterproductive in a wide range of different ways. And I think there's something powerful, Eddah, in what you were talking about when you spoke about, at least in two different instances, when you spoke about Wangari Maathai, and you spoke about this idea that everybody can plant, right? Start with what you have, the skills you have. You can do a great many powerful things. You can end this global climate crisis, right? Start with who you are. You spoke when you were talking about peace building in Rwanda and so on. You said, let's start with the place of pain, right? I think you could also have said, let's start with the person who's experiencing the pain, the people who are experiencing the pain, right? And I think one of the great unexamined issues, and here we go into the methodological aspects that you were talking about, Mohan, or at least that your question asks us to look at. What are these methodologies that we have in the Global South? And I think that what we see repeatedly, you could go back to Paulo Freire, you can go to Steve Bantu Biko here in South Africa, is this constant interest in conscientization. Now, why is conscientization so important? I've got a chapter that's come out sometime last year in a book edited by Thomas Tufter and others, in which I say the reason why conscientization is so important, or at least an unexamined reason, is that it reconnects us with our pain. And we need to understand that it's really tragic that we have to say to people, hey, look, these wars that you're involved in are bringing you pain. It's really tragic that we have to say to people, hey, look, this abuse of women that you're engaged in is actually destroying your community, your family, is destroying your humanity, right? We are reconnecting these people. We are trying to reconnect them to this experience of pain. We are trying to reconnect them to who they are. Now, let's remember that the person is the most important instrument of research, we often say. the most important methodological instrument that is available to us. Let us remember that when we talk about method, we're talking about a word whose roots go back to an idea of a path. Let's remember that when we talk about the word path, we can reconnect that to another word, career, that reconnects us to this idea of a CV, a curriculum vitae, a life path, a history. What is at stake, I think, when you're in the question you're asking is, these struggles related to these pains that we live with, that make our lives brutish and short, how can we be reconnected to them? And the answer, I think, lies in reconnecting people to their paths, to who and what they are, their histories, in these multiple ways that will remind us, Devika, of what it is to be human. And I think that is the true intersected place where we meet, right? And the true power, as you're saying, of these movements is that they're intersected. They're intersected in what? They're intersected in shared human solidarity. And one of the truly wonderful things that's happening in Africa at the moment is in human rights law, where one of the great contributions to human rights law is the so-called third wave of human rights thinking, where Africans are driving onto the world agenda this right to solidarity, right? As a fundamental right. So I think that there are multiple elements that one can look at. I've got so many things that have been excited by the comments and the observations that Devika and Eddah, have made. I think I should stop here, but clearly I found a great deal to chew upon.
Cholin, thank you so much. And again, you bring us back to this notion of reconnecting, right? You connect with Eddah's articulations about reconnecting with the pain. You connect with Devika's articulations of the notion of disorder and how do we actually work through that disorder. And this question that you keep bringing us back to is this notion of building connection to thinking through our histories about and about what is to be human, and then about reconnecting to our paths, paths that we might have lost because of ongoing processes of disorder and seeding disorder. It's beautiful. I want to go now to our audience and the questions that our audience have asked. Breeze, if you will open up the Zoom window for me. There was a question from Sophie. I'm going to read that out to you. I feel the obedience to the superiority of the West has become a symbol for modernization. The global South has intra-discrimination according to the white logic, oppressing one another. I am from China, and China has many economic projects with African countries. China had been, at least partially, colonies of the Western countries, but the official or mainstream representations of Africa is similar to those discriminative and even racist ones that were once made by the white people now. As for example, Africans wearing grass skirts and eager to marry their daughter to a Chinese salaryman who was dressed up a business suit, were played out on the biggest TV show on Chinese New Year of Eve of 2018. The issue here is how to have a shared view of colonization. Any of you want to respond to that?
If I can have a stab at that. I think that you're quite rightly, it's important for us to recognize the multiple centers that are at stake. So it's not at all true that we only have to worry about Western domination. even within our own countries. And I think this is part of the point that Devika was making with references to struggles to do with caste, for example, in India. We do indeed have also in between and amongst countries have to deal with this really important set of questions. Here in South Africa, one of the questions that I've repeatedly wanted to raise, and I'm working on a paper at the moment to do with it, is this question of beggaring our neighbors. The ways in which, for example, South Africa adopts trade policies that effectively beggar the neighbors, impoverish the neighbors. Now, how could you possibly flourish as a country when you beggar your neighbors? How can we as economies of the South possibly hope to flourish collectively when we beggar our neighbors, when we adopt exploitative logics in various sorts? How can we as human beings hope to live a life that is characterized by dignity, recognition of our worth, when our practices dehumanize others? So these cycles of domination, oppression, and so on have to be ended in some particular way. And certainly what is described here is but one example of those cycles at work. Mm-hmm. And I think what is hinted at is the possibility of a rehumanizing alternative that we still have to articulate in so many different ways.
So, Mohan, can I jump in?
Yes.
So, I completely agree with what Cholin is saying. I'm also wary sometimes of how easily we blame late European colonization on everything that went wrong with South Asia, with the continent of Africa, with Latin America. We have to understand that. We know historically that human beings are wretched with hierarchy, right? Like we have had our own hierarchical systems that were easily enough, easily visible in order for subjugation by whatever power was coming in to work with, right? So, and of course, one of the ways that I'm sure we all do in our classes is that whiteness is no longer really about the West, and it's no longer really about whiteness or West or European or being European. What is dangerous about whiteness is that it replicates itself in various contexts and settings in a very dangerously accelerated way. And so when you see newer forms of colonization, like we need to actually untether the idea. We know that European colonization was very, very consequential to the world, but we now need to untether that idea of European colonization and whiteness, because I think that whiteness has a life of its own, right? And whiteness as an ideology is something in itself. And the way that I see India and the way that I see China functioning in the world is a premise on those same logics in a way, right? And if you want to call that, I hate throwing the word neoliberalism just randomly, but yes, it's a neoliberal logic, right? And so, I think for me, that's the new way of thinking about, and I don't know what's the out from this, but I think we have to, as societies and societies in the global South, have to look inward at ourselves and see what it is that has caused us to keep co-opting different forms of hierarchical logics. Because we can't just say 250 years of European rule did this to us, right? Because we had inherent hierarchical logics. And in India, you know, I mean, caste is the biggest destroyer, right? And it is what was used by the British in order to, it was one of the ways that disorder was created, right? And so I really think that there has to be a very serious reckoning with our ancient histories in order to rebuild. And because, you know, the 250 years does not take away the, I mean, you know, 2000 a millennia or 2 millennia of hierarchical histories that exist. So, I mean, I think that there has to be like a collective soul searching. I don't know how that project is possible, but there has to be, right? I mean, it might happen and I really believe that education is where it has to happen. It has to happen in schools and colleges, and literally it has to happen in kindergarten, nursery onwards, teaching truthful, honest history, right? And not just saying, oh, you know, here's us, the wounded India that was destroyed by the British, right? Like we can't. That's not going to take us anywhere, like much further.
You know, in connection to the idea of where this blame lies and how we get ourselves from it. Earlier on, I had talked about Danny's work when he was understanding trying to explain what was happening in Rwanda, and called Rwandans or the Hutu victims that became killers. So looking at our colonial histories, have we become what Amdani, you know, so as how victims, you know, we ourselves as the colonized as victims, then we become killers, we become conspirators in all these ideas. It is very sad. Secondly, I find the idea of authority problematic because in many of our cultures, how we respond to authority is very clear cut, and that there's hierarchy and you have to listen. You have to, you know, the elders, those in power, whatever gives one status. The idea that this is culturally acceptable and pretty difficult to challenge, and it has been used as an excuse for bad behavior. That is why we still vote for these people. That is why we have not been able to get rid of dynasties in Kenya. If the president is not Kenyatta or the son, it is Raila Odinga or the son, just the same people, because, oh yeah, you know, it's better the devil you know than those you don't know, that kind of thing. How do we begin? And it's really hard. And when we know, as the kind of work that we do, we respect culture very much because we know the benefits that it gives. But at what point do we get away from that? How do we teach? I agree with education totally. Do we, you know, even in our homes, you know, are we willing to tell our sons, don't do that to a girl, you know, don't do this. So this is very complex, Sophie. And it's something that just requires a very gentle discussion because it is, you know, from all directions, there is no straightforward solution, but it's just debating and thinking about the little changes that we can make. It's really hard and very upsetting. I have seen how the Chinese stuff is going on in Nairobi, and I feel very bad about it. And it makes me very angry about it when I see my people being colonized by a fellow person who we are supposed to be in the same category, you know? Yeah, that's what it is.
Thank you for this powerful conversation. I just want to, add here something that Purva had said, and this ties in with what Devika was articulating, that, for instance, as Indians, we have to reckon with the notion that casteism in India predates European colonialism, and that's a powerful notion, and that goes back to the point you were raising, Devika, about the hierarchies in our societies that have lent themselves to these colonizing processes and the seduction for colonization.
Right, and I think to consider, so even when we talk about skin color, right? And so in my classes, when we're talking about the formation of race, right? It's, you can talk about it in terms of how race was produced post-Enlightenment, but notions of fairness exist in our texts, and of the linkage between beauty and fairness exists in the Vedas. Those are 3,000 years old, and they exist in Chinese texts. Those are 5,000 years old. So, I mean, we have to reckon with those kinds of racial hierarchies that have existed in our own societies, rather than thinking that racial formation emerges, with the Enlightenment project, where you had the systematization, right, of racial categories. So.
I'm pretty keen to say something.
Okay, I know, I'm sorry, I barged in.
No. Can I leap in? A few things, powerful things have been said. I mean, Eddah, you spoke about, and so I agree with this idea, Devika, that you speak of, that we have to deal with these divisions, these inequities, these injustices that predate colonization, as we currently are dealing with it. European colonization, as we are currently dealing with it. But, and I think a really important book for me, a brilliant little book to look at, is Mamdani's little book, Define and Rule. I love this book for the ways in which it really gets to the nub of an issue. And this is the issue of how colonialism was organized, how this disorganization was achieved. And he talks about it in terms of beginning with the Sepoy revolt in India. And he identifies Lord Mayne as a key figure. Lord Mayne, who learns certain ideas about the native, and in fact, on Mamdani's terms, defines what the native is. And that definition of the native is then taken from, is applied in India, associates the native with culture, with a culture that has these characteristics, Eddah, that you spoke of. The native is somebody who respects their elders, who listens to their elders, who does not rebel, who acquiesces, who is not entrepreneurial, who does not change, as do people who are ruled by law. Those who are ruled by culture are not progressive in the wide range of ways that we now talk about. They're not Western, right? And this idea is then applied in Africa, is applied elsewhere where the British have rule coincides, I would say not coincidentally, coincides with the ways in which we have colonized people, othered people all over the world being described, right? Everywhere we go, we are collectivists. We are people who listen to our elders in various ways and blindly obey, and so on and so on. One of the consequences of this history is the ways in which we are disconnected from our history. Here in Africa, it's particularly acute. We are disconnected, for example, from somebody as recent as King Shaka, perhaps the most well-known African. Right? So if we say King Shaka, people say Africa, pretty much everywhere, right? Some surveys have been done. King Shaka is perhaps the most well-known, and then you have Mandela, or Mandela and then King Shaka. So more or less in that sort of order. But we know very little about King Shaka. We don't know how he looked. I mean, he was alive in 1830 and then thereabouts, not so long ago. We don't know how he looked. We don't know what he did. What we have that remains are these myths that have been created. Myths that were then instrumentalized, for example, to create the conditions for the establishment of customary law within our context, following a template that had been learned from Lord May, right? A template which allowed us to be disconnected from our histories, disconnected from our own issues, our own needs. Hence, we need a Paulo Freire to come and remind us, hey, you people in Africa, hey, you people in South Africa, feel your pain, be conscientized, reconnect to your life paths, and so on. There's a tragedy, and I think we need to understand some of the roots of that. I can go on.
Wow. Thank you so much, Cholin, for that reflection. Is there anyone, I know that we are sort of coming close to the end of the session, and I wanted to ask the audience if there is anyone that wanted to ask a question directly to our panelists. Okay, I will start wrapping up then by perhaps asking you, Cholin, Devika, and Eddah, to see if you have any last words that you would like to share with us.
I'll have a stab quickly. I think that there's a methodological pathways that we should explore. I think a really important possibility that we have tried to theorize, a colleague, Ilva Rodney Gumede and I, is an idea that we've written off in terms of what we've called smash and grab methodology, that says, given that others are licensed and we are not, right? Given that others are recognized and we are denied, there's an attempt to erase us from history. Given that we are, as colloquially said, constantly made into suspects, constantly criminalized, what would happen methodologically if we accepted this position, at least for methodological purposes? What would happen if we learned from the habits and practices of thieves, or those who are labeled thieves, kind of a Robin Hood logic, if you would like, right? What would happen if we understood how thieves manage to identify that which is of value, how they manage to position themselves to be able to access it? What would happen if we assumed this position for the purposes of stealing back humanity, if you would like, from a system which delegitimizes being human? how would we do this? And of course, in doing that, we've learned a great deal from feminists who have, in certain instances, for example, even adopted the position of the slut, the name of the slut, in order to rehumanize the slut and themselves and all women, and so on. So there are methodological pathways that have been explored. Certainly ours is but one, and there are many others from the South that perhaps might be of interest.
Cholin, you talked about what if questions, and I am thinking right away about Kamrov and Kamrov essay, where, you know, where, and my gosh, I have, the title has just skipped my head, but it's about, oh, theory from the South. You know, their essay, Theory from the South, and they raise the what if. For them, they say, what if we change? What if we did this? And I agree with you. I want us to explore more of those what if questions. So that, for example, what if we talk about culture? And I'm just thinking, I wrote down here as we're talking about some of the things that are really culturally painful so that we don't seem to romanticize culture. I was thinking about stories that I've had about the pain of barrenness in our communities in Africa, and I'm sure in other, women that cannot bear children. You think, what if, you know, the pain that comes with what they have to go through in the name of culture? What if a practice like that, where you don't have, another woman doesn't have to be brought home because you can't bear? Can people just understand? It is not the, you know, it could be anything. Why should the woman suffer because she cannot bear children? Again, what if? You know, I hope we can explore these issues and really develop theories that explain our circumstances. Something like that. There are practices in our cultures which the West, even the Western theory, cannot explain. It's only us who can do it.
Is it my turn? So I don't want to end on a pessimistic note, but I often I know that we've been talking about dismantling whiteness, and one of the ways that we've attempted to do this in the academy, at least in the West where I have been trained, is that, you know, we rely on areas such as post-colonial studies and decolonial studies. And I've taught courses in these subjects, and I continue to teach courses in these subjects, but I have a deep respect for them, but I'm also, the more I teach them, the more ambivalent I get about the possibilities of theorizing the human condition with the same logics that we have been trained in. And so it seems like the circular loop, right? You're just sort of relying on deconstruction, deconstructive processes. And of course, one of the ways that we think about moving ahead is reconstruction. And, you know, I'm really interested now in the idea of really beginning to look at very, very fundamentally, in a very quotidian, in a very everyday sense, like, what is it to live? What does it mean to decolonize your everyday, your day after day after day? how do you decolonize a life? And not so much how do you decolonize frameworks and entire disciplines, but how do you live in a way that in which you are chipping away at this on a daily basis in the decisions that you make. And so I'm really, I'm more inspired by the arts, by poetry, by the mingling of poetry, the imagination, art, and by just living, right? What does it mean to have a life? What does it mean to live? And what does it mean for a person in this kind of body that I have, or a person of color? And by the way, I'm only a person of color in the United States. Everywhere else, I'm just a person. So, how does that person live, right? I'm really, really more tied to this kind of a quotidian, ordinary experience, and trying to understand that experience and so I want to think of the body as theory. I want to think about living as theory, right? I want to think about, and so as much as I want to say that theory is a project of erasure, which is where I began, I want to say that, to live well is also about theorizing too. And I'm not saying that, and I'm speaking from a very privileged position as an academic in the West. And so to live well is an actual, is an aspiration. But under all circumstances, how do people live? And how do they chip away at everyday life? And that's really what I'm more interested in. And maybe that's indigenous, and maybe that's, but the minutiae has become really important for me. And as much as I teach this, like these larger frameworks, I'm really more interested in, like, how do I make this decision that I'm going to make in the next 10 minutes about some kind of media that I might consume, and how can I remove that from my life in order to enrich it further, right? Or in different ways. Does this make any sense? I don't want to, I have been really tied to the quotidian for almost 5 years now, and probably that is why I'm working on a project on objects. I'm interested in how people live with objects and carry them, and in the way that mobilities work in migration and all of that. So,
Devika, I'm smiling because I've become a WhatsApp farmer in rural Kenya. And that is how I'm decolonizing my life every day. And I have learned every dollar what is happening on this land where I'm working with women. Every dollar I am accounting for it. And my cousins back home laugh and they say, oh, wow, you're doing well. What's up, farmer? But just, basic things such as the whatever Kenya shilling the ladies get. One of them told me, my daughter, since we began this land project here, Eddah, my daughter has not missed school because she didn't have sanitary towels. Man, that matters more to me than even being a professor, knowing that a woman is telling me her daughter is not missing school anymore because she didn't have sanitary towels. So anyway, it is possible. I admire that. My friends told me that is called WhatsApp farmer, telephone farmer, and that's what I've become. And it helps my mental. I calm down and I realize that there are more important things in life to think about rather than just my own privilege or dealing with the harshness of the US Academy or outside, just getting out of the street from my house and the terror that I've got to go through in my Black body. So what I found when I am doing my WhatsApp telephone farming, my gosh, I am affirmed, I am happy, I am speaking my language, and I am seeing everything happening, and it's worth my life right now.
It is just, this has been so inspiring, you three, just so amazing. I'm going to just summarize brief sayings or imaginaries from you as a way to wrap this up. Cholin, I love your idea of learning from the habits of thieves, learning how to steal back our humanity. How powerful is that? Devika, you talked about your ambivalence, but then you situated that within that context of really that fundamental question about method as what does it mean to live a life, the everyday of the life, and how does that everyday life chip away at the broader context within which we find ourselves. What does it mean to live well is about theorizing. And, you know, Eddah, I love how you talk about this idea of the WhatsApp farmer. I'm going to stay with it. But I think there is a powerful idea that we as human beings are connected to others in our communities, and communities might be here or communities might be elsewhere. But these communities are spaces of imagination, right? Of taking back our capacity to imagine and engage with this question of what does it mean to be human. I want to wrap up by thanking each one of you for this powerful session. You have left us with many ideas to grapple with, and from so many different ways of really looking at the question of method and epistemology within the broader project of empire and whiteness. For our audience across the globe, we will come back in about 20 minutes for the next session, which really picks up on this to ask questions of gender, caste, and decolonization. So once again, thank you. And hopefully we will use this as a basis for building our coalitions and our solidarity.
Thank you for inviting us, Mohan.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Really important, fascinating. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Okay.